Okay, so this is part two of the of native trees of South Florida. We did part one in December. There, I'll try to provide the recording for everybody that's attending here. Both of this talk and the previous version of it that we did in December, whenever we follow up with an email. But with that said, I guess we'll get right into it here because we've got a lot of plants to cover. We're not covering nearly as many as we would like to, and we'll once we get to the end here, we'll kind of cover what we might be doing into the future, which is maybe spinning this off into even more um, resources related into what we're showing you all today. So next slide, please. So I guess the big thing that we component to education with the University of Florida is in terms of thinking about plants and how their horticultural uses in the landscape, we tend to think of the flora-friendly landscaping principles. And really, this is all about right plant, right place. But in order to plant the right plant for the right place, you need to know what plants would be a good fit for the site. And so hence that's really the whole purpose of what we're trying to cover here today, and just giving you more options potentially, because a lot of times certain plants are overused in the landscape, and but however, there might be a lot of wonderful alternatives out there that people just don't talk about enough, or and consequently, there's not a ton of availability in nurseries for them as well. So next slide, please. And so we really want you all to think of trees based on some of their ID features, because some of these you might be encountering out in natural areas, and they can be kind of difficult to determine from one another. And then also think of trees based on their usages within South Florida landscapes. And so some of this goes back to their natural history. Most of the plants that we're covering here are native to, I guess you would say, broadleaf hammocks, trees that are found in um, generally speaking, kind of upland areas where these broadleaf trees will be growing. And I guess there's native versus non-native. All of these are going to be natives, and then tolerance of different environmental conditions. Generally, most of these prefer things on the drier side, but some of them have wonderful, they hold up quite well to wet sites as well. So we'll try and cover those wherever it makes sense. And I think Yvette is going to mention something here about sourcing
Okay.
the tree. So
Yeah, so when we're talking about using unusual native plants, a natural first question is whether and how to even source these plants. So here are a few resources to help. Um, John has used Plant Ant quite a bit. And so they're a good resource that they're the ones that, as you hear us today, we're going to be referencing availability based on the information and Plant Ant, which is a wholesale nursery resource. There is also the Florida Association of Native Nurseries, and they have a plant finder search tool that you see here down in the corner. And if you apply that search here to Florida Red Bay, you can see, they offer some information about cultivating the species, hardiness zones and plant communities, and the nurseries where it can be found along with their contact information. And you also may want to know, if you're just getting into natives and wanting to learn more about using them, FAN is also a great resource for networking, trade shows, CEU classes, etc. And lastly, oh, I also wanted to mention Natives for Your Neighborhood. I'll talk about them more throughout, but that's part of the Institute for Regional Conservation. And they have some good resources I'll share later. Lastly, inquire at local nurseries, even if you know or believe that, a certain plant is not stocked by a local nursery that you frequent. It can't hurt to ask, and that may affect future inventory decisions that nursery makes. So go ahead, John. Okay, well, he's busy, but basically we just wanted to share that, we're going to be presenting hardiness zone information in this presentation. And, the hardiness zones have changed. So on the right is the 2023 information. And if you don't have that, definitely seek it out. And that's a good resource. Especially when working with new plants that you aren't necessarily familiar with using in the landscape at present time. So diving right into our first species we're going to highlight today is paradise tree. And paradise tree makes a great shade tree, reaching heights of up to 40 feet. It does have large surface roots though, so you want to plant it where it can have a good amount of open space beneath, and be careful with mowers so as not to damage the roots. And I think all leaves are beautiful, but these are pretty glamorous. They're shiny, dark green above with waxy pale or glaucous coloration on the underside. And in this picture on the left, each of what initially looked to be leaves are actually leaflets making up a feather-like pinnately compound leaf. So each of those leaves are going to be about 6 to 16 inches long and comprised of 10 to 14 leaflets. So these big glossy feathery leaves that this plant has make it really lovely. And paradise tree is dioecious, meaning that the male and female flowers are born on separate plants. If you have a female plant, you will see the flowers, which can be pretty showy, as shown in the picture on the left. The fruits turn dark blue or purple when they're ripe, and they're a good food source for birds. But with the, fleshy, dark colored fruits falling beneath the tree, birds visiting the tree, and those surface roots, that's all the more reason to leave some nice open space beneath the paradise tree. And really, who would want to pave over paradise roots or park on them anyway? So I had to go for that. The natural habitat for the paradise tree, as with, like John said, many of these we'll be covering, is within our coastal hammocks. On the left is a picture of a hammock where I saw some paradise tree growing at Twin Rivers Park in Martin County, alongside gumbo limbo, stopper, red bay, and many other natives. And you'll see us use distribution maps like the one shown in the center. We'll be using these throughout the presentation. These maps are from the Atlas of Florida Plants, which is a great resource for information on Florida's plants, including species photo galleries, notes on invasiveness, scientific names, and more. And you can see from this map that paradise tree has been documented in coastal counties from the southern tip of Florida up through Brevard County on the east coast of the state. Another resource for species distribution information is the Institute for Regional Conservation's Natives for Your Neighborhood website. which has species descriptions, distribution maps, photographs, and information on natural habitats and wildlife value for native species. And this map you see on the right, it shows a similar distribution to the data we just saw from the Atlas of Florida plants. But here you can also quickly see locations where an occurrence is natural, cultivated, or other. And as you can see for paradise tree, most of the observations documented here are of this plant growing naturally. So it either hasn't been used much in landscapes or at least has not been documented in planted occurrences. In our area along the Treasure Coast, I don't see it often used in planting, but that may be different further south in Florida. So if you want to, with any of these, really share in the chat where you've seen paradise tree planted. So the next species I'll be talking about is black ironwood. It's in the buckthorn family, which includes jujube, ziziphus. Black ironwood is typically a small stature tree, getting to about 15 to 30 feet in height, with a trunk that usually measures less than a foot in diameter. It doesn't typically have the broad canopy you'd get with a paradise tree or an oak or something similar, but it is an attractive evergreen with red tinged new growth, glossy leaves, and textured bark, pictured here. The flowers of black ironwood are small, yellow-green in color and fragrant, as shown in the picture on the right. And the fruit is similarly small. It's about a 1/4 inch, round, shiny black drupe. And you can see some of those photos if you look really close in the picture on the left, some of those fruits there. Black ironwood is native to southeastern coastal Florida, as well as the Caribbean and Central America, where it grows as canopy or subcanopy tree in hammocks. It's only been vouchered as far north as Brevard County currently here in Florida. It does have a good resistance to strong winds. And looking at Plant Ant, it shows that wholesale nurseries from Palm Bay down into South Florida sell black ironwood. And the prices that I saw yesterday range from $8 for a 3-gallon to up to $1,600 for a 100-gallon specimen with, 12-foot height, nice full canopy. And now I'll turn it over to John to talk about satin leaf.
Okay, so next we've got satin leaf. This is one that kind of you see a little bit more used in some of the urban environments. It's a member of the Sapodilla family. And so, I mean, there's quite a few fruit species that we think of being as part of it, like canistel, lucuma, mamey, miracle fruit. They're all like in this family. And it has an edible fruit as well, which we'll get to here. But the really nice thing about this one for us is that it has a really nice form. It's ideal in many ways for growing around here because it doesn't require a ton of maintenance for to maintain like that ideal shape. So which is the excurrent form. And because of that, it's also relatively resistant to hurricane winds as well, because of this form is a naturally stronger based on that more pyramidal type shape. So, and it does get to be a decent sized tree. It can grow 35 to 45 feet tall. And another thing that really stands out about it is the leaf, really glossy, dark green on the upper side, and the underside is that rusty, pubescent, hairy underside, which we go out of our way to cultivate trees to have this gene sometimes. So magnolias, we've cultivated the ones with this gene. Not all magnolia, southern magnolias will have that ability to do it, but pretty much all of the satin leaves that you'll see will have this trait, which is something that we tend to like and we think is desirable. Next slide, please. So you can see very similar range to some of these that we've showed so far, largely found throughout the Caribbean, Central America. And then like in Florida, it goes all the way up the coast to Brevard County naturally. And another good thing about this one is if you're looking for natives and something, it's something that's still unique. This hits a lot of desirable I guess, traits in terms of something that can be used in landscapes, could be used more. This one has high availability. So this is something that you could probably find sourced through wholesalers at maybe a more reasonable rate compared to a lot of the other natives that we're going to be covering. And then the only thing is I've heard it can be relatively slow growing and difficult to establish. And like it doesn't necessarily like our urban soils the most, which is kind of unfortunate. But on the other hand, if the soils are in good enough condition in an urban area, they'll probably respond fairly well. And there's pretty good examples around of these turning into like large mature trees, like in parking lots and stuff like that. So next slide, please. So you can see here's, like I mentioned, wide scale nursery production. Literally there's a nursery in Homestead that's called Satin Leaf Nursery that, and here is their satin leaf collection there, a good chunk of them. Next slide, please. And here's one planted like in a parking lot next to a Costco in Palm Beach Gardens. So, I mean, they are around and they are getting fairly good usage relative to some of these other species that we're going to be covering. Next slide, please. Oh, and then also another cool thing about this, like I mentioned, there's a lot of edible fruits, plants in this family that are used for their edible fruit. There's a very close relative to it called the kamito or the star apple, and it is kind of like a bigger version of the fruit that you'll find on the satin leaf. And interestingly, the satin leaf, it's been used as an ornamental in other countries and it's considered to be a nuisance or invasive. So in Australia, it's actually a problematic species there. So next slide, please. Okay, so next is false mastic. We're still in the same family here, the Sapitaceae, the Sapodea family. And this is one that can be turned into a large mature tree. A lot of the trees that we're going to be covering that you find in these hammocks in South Florida tend to be kind of short statured, but this we're kind of covering some of the ones here that would actually mature into full size trees. It's got some interesting flowers, I think, and fruit as well. It's got an orange yellow drupe that's edible. So I think in the next slide, please, you can see that there. And so I'm not sure they're super desirable fruit based off of what I was reading, but that is a feature that some people like to have, especially for wildlife. And then next slide, please. And so you can see here's an example, like we mentioned, 50 to 70 feet tall. They can mature into relatively mature or large trees. You can see here, it goes all the way north to, I think, Volusia County, where they have been found naturally. And it does have pretty high resistance to storm wind. It's also a good thing about this one is it's got high salt tolerance. It's relatively fast growing, and it's got an interesting buttress roots as well, which many people tend to like. However, there is a specific pest. Next slide, please. So there is a psylla that's associated with it that can cause the leaves to look not that great. And I mean, I guess this is also shared with other members of the family. So Sideroxylon, technically you probably might have learned many of these back in the day as Bumelia. So this can affect some of the other trees in that Sidera xylon, which I think interpreted is ironwood. There's a lot of things that are called ironwood, but this one actually has it in its Greek name, I believe. I know it's Latin, but I think that the interpretation would have been Greek originally. And so this is just a big one to be considerate about as well. Not every a lot of the things don't necessarily have a lot of pests, but this one is something that tends to come up. Next slide, please. And in terms of availability, there's a moderate amount of availability for this one. There's not a ton. So here's the plant ant. I tend to go with the plant ant a lot of time just to get a better sense of like what the wholesalers are putting out. And so here's what currently is out there in terms of on the wholesale website side. Next slide, please. So willow bustic, another Sidera xylon. As I mentioned, this one was one of the ones that was formerly under the Bumelia. And this one can also get to be pretty tall, but typically you'll see it much more as a shrub to a small tree. I think it's, from what I was reading, like it's really uncommon to see it beyond 20 or 30 feet. And it is a pretty nondescript leaf, very similar to the other tree we're just looking at here, but it is aromatic when crushed. And this one too also has a fruit at maturity. It's technically a berry that turns red and then black. So next slide, please. So here it is at various stages of flowering. On the left-hand side, this is before the flowers had fully come out. And then on the left, or on the right, we've got what the flowers look like close up. Next slide, please. And this is what the fruit looks like at maturity. So it's edible. Next slide, please. And yeah, like a lot of these native to South Florida, a little bit more range than some of the ones that are just Monroe and Miami-Dade endemics. This one does go up to, it looks like Martin County here. And so it's got 10A to 11 hardiness. There's not anything on wind resistance for this one, but based off of what else is in its family, it's probably at least moderate. And there's high value for these, like I think most of these Sidera xylons, like as pollinators and larval hosts to insects. So next slide, please.
Okay. So I'll be talking next about wax myrtle. And wax myrtle is a species in the Myricacea or bayberry family. And in Florida, that family is represented by 3 species of Morella, all of which are native according to Wonderland's Guide to the Vascular Plants of Florida. Wax myrtle is pretty common in nature, though for as common and adaptable as it is, we don't often see it used in landscapes, so we're including it here. It can be grown as a shrub or a small tree, about 15 to 25 feet in height. There's a picture there. And it tends to form genets or clonal colonies. So it can make a fast growing hedge and can have multiple stems or trunks. And then go forward one. Oh, there we go. The picture on the left shows a close-up of the leaves. So you can see they have teeth along the margins towards the tips of the leaves. If you crush a leaf, you're going to experience it. It's fragrant, and that's because the stem and leaves and branches contain aromatic compounds. But be aware that that aromatic resin is flammable. Wax myrtle is considered a potential fire hazard. So it's recommended that you do not plant wax myrtle within the defensible space of your home. And that's usually about a 30-foot area or so outside of the home, in which only low flammability plants should be planted. If you'd like more information on firescaping for landscaping, check out the University of Florida has a few resources for fire-wise landscaping. All right, the flowers of wax myrtle are borne on catkins, which are dense spikes or racemes of unisexual flowers that lack petals. And typically these male and female flowers shown in the picture here are going to be borne on separate plants, but sometimes wax myrtles will have both male and female flowers on the same plant. From the flowers, we get that characteristic waxy wax myrtle fruit that's shown in this lower left image. And wax myrtles, as I said before, they're found in nature across a wide range of habitats, from scrub to freshwater wetlands. Wax myrtle does well as kind of a pioneer species in disturbed areas, in part because it can fix its own nitrogen and improve soil fertility. Usually we think of plants in the pea family as having this ability to fix our own nitrogen, but wax myrtle can do it too. When planted along shorelines, the Environmental Learning Center in Vero notes that wax myrtle serves as a shoreline stabilizer and provides aquatic habitat for animals like turtles, ducks, cormorants, and frogs. And when its branches and roots extend into the water, the plant also becomes a host to minnows and other small fish. With its usually dense foliage and multiple stems, wax myrtle also offers shelter and structure for nesting birds. And its seeds are a food source for small granivorous birds and other wildlife. And wax myrtle is a larval host plant for the banded hairstreak and the red banded hairstreak butterflies. So if you see something gross looking like this feeding on your wax myrtle, don't worry, this is a pupa of the red banded hairstreak butterfly, which becomes the colorful adult you see in the top right image. So I also wanted to point out the gray bark of the wax myrtle, which contrasts well with the green of the leaves. Here in the US, wax myrtle is native to coastal states, extending all the way up into the southern tip of New Jersey. And here I also wanted to show you another resource for maps of species distribution, and that is iNaturalist. And you can see how it shows the dark red kind of primary distribution in the US as being along the coast, though they also note occurrences further inland and elsewhere across the globe. And though it occurs along our coasts, it does not have a high resistance to wind, which could be because it's kind of more of a pioneer species, not like a long-lived late successional species. As far as availability, wax myrtle is available at wholesale nurseries throughout Florida. So try some out in your next project. Get back over to John.
Okay, so yeah, our next species is in the same family, and it's myrtle of the river. So way less of a widespread range for this one. Very situated, I guess, like from obligate almost to southeast Florida. And so the genus was formerly Caliprantes. So or Caliptrantes, that is what you might have to look it up for if you're trying to source it potentially. And it does not get very tall. Of all of these, this one is one of the shortest ones we're covering. It maybe gets 15 or 20 feet. And so, but, there are tons of uses for these things that border closer towards being shrubs. And again, it's got a really nice glossy leaf. It's opposite, and it has, like many things in this family, it's slightly aromatic when it's crushed. And it flowers late spring to early summer. And you can see here, it's a technically actinomorphous. That means it's just got symmetry that you can cut over many different divisions. It's not just what bilateral symmetry, it's radial. And then there's also tons of white, many stamens like on it. And this is very common for the flowers for this family within the Myrtaceae to have. The fruit eventually turns into a dark blue berry, and it's technically edible as well, like at maturity. Next slide, please. So here's just some examples based on various nurseries that are out there that have grown it. On the furthest right-hand side, you can actually see what it would look like in a natural area. So yeah, not a very tall plant, and we definitely has more of the form or shape that we think of as being shrub-like. So next slide, please. So as I was mentioning, the range is a little bit interesting on this one, and so are what technically categorize or how this plant technically falls into being a species in general. There's some dispute whether it is just a subspecies of something similar that's found more widespread throughout the Caribbean. But apparently there are differences, and so like it is unique to our area. But the only other places that they've shown it to be naturally found, at least according to iNaturalist and what I could find on the Florida Botanical Atlas, was Jamaica, South Florida, and the Bahamas. So wind resistance, it's small. Most smaller things tend to have decent wind resistance, so it's probably medium to highest. And availability, somewhat available. Compared to other things out there, like I was kind of surprised, especially considered that this one is endangered within the state of Florida, that you can find it here in some places somewhat easily. Next slide, please. So yeah, and here's what even showed up on Plant Ant. Pretty good availability for something that's an endangered species. I mean, so next slide, please. Okay, so we're switching to lancewood here, or to different family evens, which is Lauraceae. So this is technically the family is Lauraceae, which is it's named after the plant Laurel Bay, which is used as an herb for a lot of cooking, native to Europe. But there's a lot of other things that are in this family: cinnamon, camphor tree, bay laurel, avocado, sassafras. And actually, even if any of you are familiar with love vines, a lot of those are within this family too, Lauraceae. So this particular tree, the lancewood, it gets up to 30 feet tall, tends to have a pretty upright growth pattern, and it's evergreen like a lot of things in the Lauraceae. It has a really almost like nondescript leaf. It's a real leafy leaf, but it is very leathery and somewhat large. And if you crush it, it has a smell. So flowers are white, complete, perfect. They form in clusters, and they eventually turn into drupes that are present through the summer and fall. You can see here. Looks like other things that you might see in this family. So like an avocado might have a similar shape. It's a much larger version of what you might see for the fruit for some of the other things in this family. Next slide, please. So here's just some more examples of it. the bark, what clusters of leaves might look like. And you can see this one goes pretty far north up to Volusia County, native to Southeast Florida into the Caribbean basin. It prefers drier sites. It's not super salt tolerant to inundation like a lot of these hardwood hammock species. Most of them are kind of on this range, not all, but tend to prefer things a little bit on the drier side and not too salty. And this one is nice that it can take partial shade as well. And wind resistance is medium low. So next slide, please. Oh, and here's the availability. Not super, I guess, how do I put this? Not a ton of different sources for it, apparently, but if this is one that you have your heart set on, there are places to get it. So next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to a different species of that same family, red bay. And so red bay is typically grows as a short or medium-sized tree with a canopy that University of Florida describes as lush, billowy, rounded, and wonderful for shade. It often has a multi-stemmed look because it tends to branch close to the ground. The leaves are shiny, leathery, dark green above, and pale and glaucous on the undersides. And the bark, there we go. And the bark is considered showy with a ridged texture and red-brown coloration. So although it would naturally occur in wetlands, it is a facultative wetland species. Red bay is considered drought tolerant once established, and it does well on a variety of soils. It has a high tolerance to salt spray and a medium-high wind resistance. UF does recommend structural pruning to maintain that wind resistance and good structural integrity. Let's see if there's anything. Oh, and with the availability, Plant Ant shows about 5 to 7 wholesalers offering red bay in different parts of the state. So availability is more limited than some natives, but still pretty good. Red bay gets greenish flowers that then develop into dark blue fleshy drupes shown here. The fruits are a food source for birds, which can be a selling point for clients wanting to create more wildlife habitat in their yards. Between the fruits and the bird droppings, though, the red bay wouldn't be a good tree for parking lots. So plant it out in a spot where you can have open space or other plantings beneath it and watch to see which birds come to visit. I also wanted to point out that, you know, Florida is a land of many bays, which is very fortunate for us. So first we have Persea palustris or swamp bay, which is also a facultative wetland plant, but usually found in wetter conditions than red bay. And I did read that sometimes the nursery trade may confuse these two species, red bay and swamp bay. So we do have, University of Florida has a guide, a key to the common bay trees of Florida that can help differentiate amongst all of these bays. Then we also have silk bay, which is usually found on drier sites, and it's endemic to Florida. And then magnolias are often referred to as bays. This is a picture of a sweet bay magnolia. And then, of course, the southern magnolia also occurs and is used frequently in the landscape here in Florida, as John mentioned. I'm also going to spend a little time on red bay pests because there's a major one, laurel wilt, and it can be confused with one of the lesser pests. So generally, red bay is described as rugged and adaptable. So please don't let my focus on pests deter you from this plant. If you're familiar with red bay or swamp bay, you've probably noticed that their leaves often have galling, like you see in this picture. The red bay psyllid commonly forms galls on these two species, but it only causes some cosmetic damage. It's not a cause for worry or treatment. Next, the black twig borer causes twig dieback on scattered stems and leaves. But again, in the landscape, this is only a cosmetic issue, only affecting scattered stems and leaves. Last, we have laurel wilt disease, which affects trees in the laurel family, including red bay and avocado. This is a lethal disease, so it's more of a cause for concern, and there is no cure at this point. The laurel wilt is a fungal pathogen. It's transmitted by the red bay ambrosia beetle. It's been here for a number of years now, almost 20 years now. And it's throughout the state. The symptoms include wilted foliage, like you see in the image on the left. So the leaves stay attached to the tree, they wilt and turn brown. And this symptoms progress to fully engulf the tree within a matter of weeks. And if you look close at an affected tree, you may also see these sawdust noodles, as they're called, like in that top right picture. And that's the frass from the ambrosia beetles. But again, laurel wilt is a fungal pathogen. So just seeing this evidence of beetles doesn't necessarily mean there's laurel wilt as well. A more definitive way to determine if the issue is laurel wilt is to look for that dark staining in the sapwood, like pictured in this lower right image. And that staining is a result of the fungal infection. So laurel wilt occurs across the entire state. So if you haven't already seen it, you will no doubt encounter it at some point soon. Researchers are working to breed individual trees that are naturally tolerant to or resistant of laurel wilt, the fungus. If you're planting trees in the laurel family, purchase them from nurseries registered with FDACs. Check them for signs of any symptoms before installation. If you have a tree affected by laurel wilt, ideally you'd want to burn or chip the affected wood at the original site or at a local disposal site. And basically limit transport, and ideally don't let that wood stay intact, burn it or chip it. So though you may not want to plant a tree that has a known pathogen like laurel wilt, diversity in the landscape is important, and red bays are native shade trees with wildlife value. I spoke with our county's horticulturist about this species, and she supports planting of red bays to keep these plants for future generations. And who knows, the next laurel that you plant may turn out to be or become parent to a laurel wilt resistant champion tree. And I wanted to end on a good note with red bay by sharing that both red bay and swamp bay are the primary larval food sources for the Palamedes swallowtail butterfly. The early instar larvae of the Palamedes swallowtail resemble bird or lizard droppings. That's in this top picture, where the larvae picture has been transposed digitally onto a picture with lizard droppings. So you can see how similar they are. And then in this picture, the bottom right, you see a fifth instar larva of the butterfly within a curled leaf. Late instar larvae of the Palamedes swallowtail have swollen thoraxes and false eyes, probably, they think, to mimic green snakes or tree frogs. So just really neat butterfly, and it relies on red bay and swamp bay for its larval food. Okay, and the last one I'm going to talk about today is Jamaican caper. It's another species where, according to the Atlas of Florida Plants, there's been a change in the scientific naming. So I'll be referring to it as Quadrella jamaiccensis. Um, Jamaican caper is in the Caparaceae family, which is the same order as cruciferous species like mustard and radish and broccoli. Not the same family, but the same order. Um, Jamaican caper can make a nice accent tree like you see here, or reaching up to 20 feet in height, or it can be used as a formal or informal hedge. I've read that the foliage grows more densely in the sun and more loose or open in shady conditions. The leaves pictured here are 2 to 4 inches long, smooth on the top surface, and pubescent or hairy on the undersides of the leaves. The flowers of the Jamaican caper are quite showy, white to violet in coloration. And then they're followed by these 3 to 6 inch long pods that open to reveal brown seeds and scarlet pulp. This is a photo John contributed of some Jamaican caper being maintained as a formal hedge at the Mounts Botanical Garden. You can see that looks pretty nice. And looking up close at it, you can see even though they've been a little rough with their hedging, the caper is still doing quite well and very well leafed out. Jamaican caper occurs in South Florida, where its natural habitat is identified as coastal hammocks and thickets. It has a low tolerance to salt water, like many of these, but high to moderate tolerance to salt wind. And Plant Ant shows it as being pretty widely available in Florida. Jamaican caper offers food and cover for wildlife, as with many of these native species we're covering, and it's a larval host for the Florida white butterflies. Natives for Your Neighborhood describes Jamaican caper as an excellent plant for coastal gardens. I'll turn it back over to John.
All right, we're at our final couple species here. So one of the ones that we're going to cover here is crabwood. So Gymnanthes lucida, a member of the Euphorbiaceae, so the spurge family. There's quite a few tropical plants that fall within this. It's a really big family. So there's croton, rubber tree, jatropha, cassava, poinsettia, just to name a few that all are within Euphorbiaceae. This one grows to be 25, maybe up to 30 feet, and has a fairly good columnar pattern for it. So usually that's somewhat desirable for a lot of people in a lot of places. And the leaf it's alternate, shiny. It's got a rounded apex and a little bit of toothing along the outside margin. And new leaves tend to be a little bit reddish if you're looking for like ID features. This one's a dioecious one, so that the flowers are going to be on different types of flowers are going to be on determine if it's, if you get a male or a female plant. There's staminate flowers are arranged in terminal axillary racemes, and it blooms year round, but tends to peak around spring and summer. And the fruit eventually turns into a black-brown capsule. So next slide, please. So you can see here on these upper photos, the maturing fruit, and then like eventually what it turns into when it's brown, the capsule has matured. So this is, again, one of these ones that's found throughout Southeast Florida. Apparently it's been found in Monroe, Miami-Dade. Somehow it skipped over Broward, but it's been found in Palm Beach. So which probably means when you see skips like that, it's usually just that people haven't looked hard enough for it, or it could potentially have been extirpated from its range at this point too, which could be the case for Broward, which is heavily urban. So it has the highest wind resistance. This is a very strong wood. So I guess it's known also as shiny oyster wood. And it's really sought after by wood carvers because as you can see in the picture here, there's a high contrast between sapwood and heartwood. The heartwood's very dark and the sapwood's light colored. So, and as a landscape species, like I mentioned, it's got a good form. It tends to not have a lot of problems. So it's a good alternative to silver buttonwood, which is really a species that it's nice. It holds up well, but like this is a good alternative if you're trying to look for something that fits in the same space, basically. And we looking on the sourcing out there, it seemed to be that there were a lot of places that carry it. Next slide, please. So this is the tree that we're going to end on here. I think there were a couple people that mentioned it in last months, and that's why I decided to include it. So this is Guyana plum, so Drypetes laterifolia flora, and it's in the family Putringivaceae. So the interesting thing about this is the only family of plants that produces mustard oils outside of the brassicas or cruciferous plants. So it's not technically within that order, but it also kind of produces these mustard oils. It gets to be 20 to 30 feet tall. Again, evergreen leaf, alternate. It looks really similar to lancewood, which is one that we covered earlier. However, lancewood, but this one's not aromatic like lancewood is. And the bark, when it matures, is a lighter color. So, and then the fruit, there's a bright red fuzzy drupe. So, next slide. Here's what it looks like. It's edible. I'm not sure that it is really known for its culinary reputation, but I think you can still eat it. Next slide, please. And then here's a picture of the bark. You can see it's a very light colored, kind of a mottled shedding type bark. As you can see, the leaves is that real, almost like things that you would see in the bay family, a real leafy, glossy leaf. Or leafy leaf is what I like to call that. It's not technical, but and then the hardiness 10A through 11 prefers drier upland sites, medium low wind resistance, and availability not super widely available. There weren't a ton of sources for it, at least based off of plant ant, but I think if you really have your heart set on it, you can probably find it. It's also called milk bark. So that might be something to look for if someone's selling it under that name. And it's got a pretty low to moderate growth rate. It's considered to be threatened by the state of Florida, so not quite on the endangered level. And it does also provide as a host for the larval host of the Florida white, which was, I think, also could be a host plant for Jamaican caper, like Yvette mentioned earlier. So next slide, please. So there are many more honorable mentions. And I think that there were so many of these as we kept going through and building up our lists and finding things that were close. I think that we're going to try and turn this into a series and eventually turn this into a resource, and that we're going to try and make this available for people to get CEUs outside of doing the webinars. So that might be something we're going to work on in 2025. Yvette and I are in the early stages of trying to figure that out. And so, but I think that there is a lot of demand for knowing more. Fortunately, FNPS, so the Florida Native Plant Society, and like has wonderful resources online, web pages for most of these. But we're going to try and expand on that. And you know, some people want information different ways, and we're going to try and provide all of that through other means. And so we'll keep expanding on all of this. And maybe next year we'll have a part 3. So So places for native trees in South Florida. Um, just in our area for botanical gardens, there's Pan's Garden. It's in Palm Beach. Mounts Botanical Garden, the building complex itself is where we have most of our natives. So if you go around we call it the back side of the property, but it's actually the western side of the property. You'll be able to find where we have most of our native plants, and some of them are mature trees. Um, and then Fairchild actually, and so they're down in Coral Gables, obviously, probably the premier garden for the area. They have pretty good resources on the natives, but I think you might have to do some searching around. I also know that Fairchild is attached to a couple of parks as well. So that might be worth investigating as well. Next slide, please. And then, yeah, just in terms of this, I mean, I tried to just pick out some of these. There's so many, and there's so many little pocket parks almost, I guess, throughout South Florida that aren't huge, but are little remnants of hammocks and that type of thing. But I guess if you're further north, maybe look at Blowing Rocks. I think Yvette might have another one or two in Martin County that might be good. In Palm Beach, there's Boynton Beach. And then as you go further south, like I mentioned, there's a variety of them. And then the Keys, there's a couple of botanical state parks that are kind of dedicated towards maintaining, like these natural environments for native plants. So Jupiter, or yeah, I don't know. So Yvette, what was the one that you were mentioning that was around you?
Twin Rivers.
Twin
We've
Rivers.
got some scrub habitat and what I would call a hammock as well.
Sweet. So yeah. Next slide. So I think, yeah, there's a variety of places to check out for inspiration. And then, yeah, here's our contact information. And I guess if, it might be time for people to head out if you need to, but we can hang around for another 10, 15 minutes here for Q&A for anybody that wants to stick around. And yeah, if you've got questions, go ahead and put them in either in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just ask us verbally right now. And so I'm looking through the chat if there was any questions. Okay, there's some people that added to this. So Delray Historical Society has an amazing native plant landscaping. So that might be worth checking out if you're in the Delray area. Is there any questions on resources? Okay, here's one. What is spacing you recommend for planting Jamaica capers as a hedge? Well, I mean, I've seen them planted, like the pictures that Yvette had as a hedge there, very, very closely. I've seen, and if you go to the Mounts Botanical Garden shop in the back where we have plants for sale, the nursery area, they'll sell them as multiple plants in the same root ball, basically, like in the same container. So I think that they tolerate being closely planted together, but I think that if you plant them too close, just like anything, some of them might get outcompeted over time and die off. So I think here I was advised at least 3 feet from center. That's probably a good general recommendation. So, but as I mentioned, sometimes there's not right or wrong answers with these things. It's going to be a little bit of trial and error depending on what your objective is. So,
All right, and
wax
someone,
myrtle. Yeah, you see that, Yvette?
yeah, and we did have some on different species in our garden. Yeah. I'll have to look into that. I didn't realize that it had decimated them. I don't know what the current, I didn't hear anything about that in reading up on wax myrtle. I don't know if it's still an issue or not now.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely have more than our fair share of like scale insects to deal with in the landscape. And yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Beth. Yeah, and if you're curious about getting more of native plants, make sure to look up the Florida Association of Native Nurseries, FANT, as well. Um, they're kind of they team up a lot with FNPS, and so they're a great resource for trying to source a lot of these plants. Yeah, I think that I see what you're saying, Beth, about the wax myrtle. You definitely see that scales and sooty mold. Okay, there is for those that are interested, uh, if you go to the FNPS chapter for Palm Beach County, if you check out their website, um, there's resources available. They're going to have an expo at Palm Beach State College. So it'll be the 22nd, 23rd. I will be one of the speakers there. I'll be you might see a little bit of overlap, like based off of like what I'll be covering there, but I mean, they've got a wonderful array of speakers. I've seen the whole program, and it looks like it ought to be, if you're interested in native plants, definitely something to check out. So there's questions about recording in PowerPoint. We will provide all of that like in a follow-up email. We'll send that your way. We've got all of your emails. And so I'll try to give that as a resource. We'll have surveys as well, and we really appreciate it if you can follow up with the surveys. It I mean, that's what keeps us going here for our reporting, and like trying to show that like what we're doing and measuring the impacts of like what we're doing. Okay, so Palm Beach State College also has a lot of native trees and shrubs planted on campus. So yeah, strong horticultural program. That's good to hear that if you go and check out their campuses, um, they probably have a fair amount of natives on there. Interesting. I see from Seth McDonald, another issue is mostly native trees are grown in containers and have girdling roots by the time they get to the size required by cities for code replacement trees. It'd be nice if they reduced the size to 4 to 6 feet to avoid this issue. I mean, but also don't be afraid to cut those girdling roots as well. I mean, sometimes it is very difficult to find good nursery stock for a lot of these natives, for sure. And that's something that we're working on. More availability in general will hopefully mean that there's better chances that you'll get good stock as well. So anything else, Yvette, or?
No, I think you did great. Thanks everybody for the participation and the chat and the questions and the resources that you provided about places to find some of these natives and some of the other pests that we didn't mention to watch out for.
Yeah, thank you all. We really enjoy having like an active group of participants. And so thanks for hanging out, everybody that was here. And we're looking forward to seeing you into the future. Next month will be restoration pruning for this series, and we'll have Dr. Andrew Kozer from Gulf Coast Research Education Center, UF, IFAS, and he will be that's a topic in Florida that that doesn't go out of style, because every year there's going to be somewhere practically that's going to need restoration pruning from the storms. So with that, I guess everybody have a good end of your week and weekend. Take care.